Week 6 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few kickers I looked at off the wire this week. The first kicker, Chase McLaughlin of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Says McLaughlin, it's been a solid year once again for him, and he's available in 84% of fantasy leagues. So this Tampa Bay offense, one of the better offenses in the league. The points have been put on the board over the last couple weeks for Chase McLaughlin, and I know he's been a better kicker at home than he's been on the road, but the next couple weeks, some good matchups coming up versus teams that give up a lot of points to kickers. Week 3 versus Denver, in that one only an extra point. Week 4 versus the Eagles, 9 fantasy points. And Week 5 at Atlanta, 16 fantasy points, including 2 50-plus yarders. So Week 6, another good matchup indoors here at the New Orleans Saints. Give up the 6th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And then Week 7, another good matchup versus the Ravens that give up 4th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. And then Week 8, once again, versus Atlanta, that gives up the most points to kickers on the year. So he's in a high-powered offense. Mike Evans, Chris Godwin, Baker Mayfield leading them down the field and making plays. And he's going to get opportunities week in and week out. Chase McLaughlin, and he's been an under-the-radar type of kicker over the last few seasons. Right now out there in 84% of fantasy leagues. Next kicker is Austin Seibert of the Washington Commanders. So what a start it's been for this Commander team, 4-1 on the season. And Austin Seibert's getting a lot of opportunities, and he only signed with this Commander team in Week 2, where he went off for a monster game with 22 fantasy points in that one. Week 3 at Cincinnati, 9 fantasy points. Week 4 at Arizona, 11. And Week 5 versus Cleveland, 10 fantasy points at 3 out of 4 games so far this season for Seibert. He's gone out there and he's had double-digit fantasy points in those games. So Seibert's getting opportunities. The Commanders are high-powered offenses in the league, believe it or not. Is Washington, led by Jaden Daniels, who turned this whole franchise around pretty quickly this season. And right now, the opportunities are just there for Seibert, available in 84% of fantasy leagues as well. The next kicker, Will Lutz of the Denver Broncos. Will Lutz, he's getting opportunity. This Bronco offense, they don't score a lot of touchdowns most weeks, even though they did put up 34 points in Week 5 versus the Vegas Raiders. The last few games for Lutz, Week 3 at Tampa Bay, 16 fantasy points. Week 4 at the Jets, 5. And Week 5 versus the Vegas Raiders, 13. So Week 6, it's going to be a grinded-out type of ball game, I believe, versus the division matchup in the AFC West in the Los Angeles Chargers. And Will Lutz, he's got a good boot going back to his New Orleans Saints days. And Sean Payton traded for him, obviously, last season for a reason, because he's familiar with him going back to New Orleans. And he's a kicker that could kick that football 50-plus yards. So next week with a decent matchup coming up versus the Chargers that have bend but don't break defense and give up field goals. He's available in 96% of fantasy leagues. Next kicker, Cam Little of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Cam Little, he was a sleeper going into last week, and Cam Little's definitely been a solid kicker this season, especially the last 2 weeks with double-digit fantasy points in the last few games. Week 3 at Buffalo, 5. Week 4, Houston, 11. And Week 5 versus Indianapolis, 14 fantasy points. So Week 6, a good matchup. London ball game versus the Bears, where it's a good kicker's atmosphere. And he's available right now in tons of fantasy leagues at 98%. And the Bears, we know they give up some points to kickers, giving up the 5th most points to kickers in the season. The Bears, bend but don't break type of defense, where they've held teams down to field goals all season long. And I believe Cam Little, once again, in this ball game in London, will get a few opportunities. And like I said, he made this roster out of nowhere this season, and the Jaguars have been happy with him and now starting to get on the fantasy radar as well. And the 5th and final kicker I looked at off the wire is Greg Joseph of the New York Giants. I've mentioned him over the last couple weeks, and Joseph, ever since New York signed him, once Graham Gano went down, from Week 3 on, he's been playing solid. Week 3 at Cleveland, 3 fantasy points. Week 4 versus Dallas, 19. And Week 5 at Seattle, 11 fantasy points. And Joseph, going back to Minnesota days a few years ago, he was one of the better kickers in fantasy football. I remember those years, putting up a lot of double-digit games in a high-powered offense with Minnesota. And this Giant team, we know, is not a high-powered offense, but they're definitely a team that gets in red zone position and stalls out a lot. In Week 6, we know they're going to have to put points on the board if they want to compete on Sunday night versus the Cincinnati Bengals. I believe Greg Joseph, once again, could go out there and have another good game, and he's available in 99% of fantasy leagues. That's a few kickers I looked at off the wire for Week 6 of the fantasy football season.